So let me introduce Phil Huss. Phil has taught for 20 years at the Sun Valley Community School, teaching English and writing, including a course on Hemingway. He has published articles related to his research on Hemingway in the Sun Valley Magazine and Big Life Magazine. He's a frequent speaker and discussion leader at the Ernest Hemingway Seminar, held each September at the community library. Phil, I believe they're still offering it virtually this year, aren't they?
Sorry, unmute myself. Yes, it is a virtual conference this year, unfortunately.
So that'll still be available. Phil graduated with a BA in English from Amherst College and an MA in English from Boston College. So if we were in a room and live, I'd say, please welcome Phil Huss, and we'd all applaud. But that we don't really do that these days. So thank you so much for joining us, Phil, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate hosting this, taking the time to walk me through how to do this, and getting more comfortable every day talking to students and giving presentations over Zoom. And thank you for everyone who's turned up. It's not just my sisters who are here on the Zoom call and my tennis partner, but more people. And I'm really, really grateful that you took some time out of this beautiful summer day to come and learn a little bit about Hemingway. I will try not to bore you. This is a topic that is fascinating to me, but I know it sometimes I can go too much in depth. But really, really just grateful that everybody's here. And I know you're like, no, thank you, Phil. Like, thank you. Finally, somebody has written another book about Ernest Hemingway. And that's probably running through your head. We really need another book on Ernest Hemingway, and I think that's fair criticism. However, I will say that all the books on Hemingway's time in Sun Valley are now out of print. So I felt like it was a prime opportunity to maybe freshen up with some news stories that I found in my research through the community library in Ketchum. But also, I just really believe that Hemingway's stories and his novels are seminal. They're some of the best works of fiction in the 20th century. But his life, even if he didn't write a single word, he didn't write the definitive World War I novel, Farewell to Arms. He didn't write the definitive Spanish Civil War novel, In Front of the Bell Tolls. He didn't completely, change the way we think about short story writing forever. Even if he didn't do all those things and just live the life that he lived, it would be fascinating. So I always like to think about, and I don't do this all the time with the courses I teach, but I always like to teach Hemingway's life and his biography and his adventures and his just passion and love for travel and hunting and fishing and frontiers, truly frontiers that he lived on throughout his life. I always like to share that with the students. So tonight, really what I hope, my main goal is to introduce you to Hemingway's Sun Valley. Many people who have tuned in are locals, and you can get this at Iconoclast here in Haley. You can certainly check it out in the library. I'll bring one by, Kristen, don't worry. And there are lots of places in Ketchum you can get them as well. You can get them at all the fly fishing shops, Lost River and Silver Creek, and Chapter One bookstore, and actually Atkinson's Market. And the Atkinsons have a really close connection with the Hemingways, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But really, I want to share with you the local stories. I think the local stories are fascinating in and of themselves, in the places that we know well here and we've spent time in. Hemingway spent time in them as well. Silver Creek, for example, he spent most of his time canoeing and hunting ducks in Silver Creek when he was here. And I always just find that fascinating when I'm going down there hunting ducks, or I'm going down there fly fishing. I always think about that Hemingway was here and loved this place. But even the Duchin Room, or the casino, and these places that we frequent, and Trail Creek Cabin, he spent a lot of time. Sun Valley Lodge, obviously. So local stories I want to share with you, but I also want to share how the local stories manifest some of the code principles. And so some of you are wondering, what's this? The title of the book is Hemingway Sun Valley, Local Stories Behind His Code, Characters, and Crisis. And so as you read around a lot of Hemingway, at least in my experience of reading around a lot of Hemingway, you find that these characters early ones start to exhibit some ways of behaving in the world that overlap with other characters, like completing tasks well, like self-assessing. And then as you go deeper into his novels and stories and read around his whole canon, you recognize that later on, especially in For Whom the Bell Tolls, he develops characters that have many, many code principles. And so the Hemingway hero is defined by a character who is able to exhibit many mutually enhancing code principles. And so I really wanted to share that these local stories have the code principles in them. And it's my belief that some of those experiences here showed up in his texts. I mean, he worked Sun Valley, Idaho into For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is amazing. He came to Sun Valley in 1939 with 12 chapters of For Whom the Bell Tolls written. One of the greatest war novels ever written, and certainly the greatest war novel about the Spanish Civil War ever written. And in the 13th chapter, he works in, the girlfriend Maria, who the main character Robert Jordan falls in love with. He says, well, maybe, after the war, we'll become Mr. and Mrs. Robert Jordan of Sun Valley, Idaho, or Mr. and Mrs. Robert Jordan of Corpus Christi, Texas. I mean, he was just throwing towns out there. It was just funny to me that he worked in Sun Valley, and kind of with a bit of a chuckle. And he said that was the freedom of fiction, so you could work in where you were into the book. But I really, his third wife, Martha Gellhorn, with who he brought to Sun Valley in 1939 and published For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940. I mean, she is Maria. I mean, if you read the descriptions of Maria and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and you look at a photo of Martha Gellhorn, of which you will see tonight, they're one and the same. And so, but really, some of the stories here and the people we spent time with, they show up in For Whom the Bell Tolls. This idea of being surrounded by mentors, by being surrounded by coded people. A lot of people that live here locally have probably perused the photos of Hemingway all over town, but particularly in the Sun Valley Lodge, where he's surrounded by, Ingrid Bergman and Clark Gable and Gary Cooper. And of course, yes, absolutely, he went to parties at Child Creek Cabin with these famous movie stars, but he spent most of his time with the local guides, with the Sun Valley Resort had a slew of fly fishing and local hunting guides, and it's the Taylor Williamses, the Bud Purdy's, the Lloyd Arnolds of the world, and their families, their wives, and their friends that Hemingway called the family. So that's really my goal, is to make a connection between the local stories and how that helps us read the code, understand the code, and how the code helps us understand what he was doing in his canon. And my secondary goal is that you pick up a Hemingway book. And thank you, Kristen, for leading with that. I really appreciate that. Most people, last time they read Hemingway was in high school, and some people found it to be somewhat like, well, what's the big deal? why is he considered so great? And I think my book won't make as much sense unless you just say, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read Farewell to Arms, or I'm going to read The Sun Also Rises, or I'm going to go back, if you want a really quick read, because school's starting, Old Man in the Sea, right? A 90-page novella. And if you really want to go deep, the 450-page For Whom the Bell Tolls. But if you pick one of these up, or just a short story, and then you go and you pick up Hemingway's Sun Valley, you'll find that story, that novel is in here. Absolutely. And you can find how that story, or at least the ideas in that story, connect to his time in Idaho, which is kind of fun. And so those are ultimately my goals. But let me share with you my presentation. And I'm gonna, for those that came in, oh geez, which one is it? For those of you that came in late, I'm just going to run through the presentation, and if you have questions and you don't want to lose the question, you can go ahead and type it into the chat. But I'm not going to try to monitor the chat while I'm talking, and I'm happy to address all those questions in the chat at the end. I'm happy to have a one-on-one with you at the end. This is a subject I never tire of talking about. I just ask my students. So just a little bit about Hemingway. Let's just dive in. So born in 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. a place he never really returned to, a place he wasn't fond of. He was not fond of his upbringing. And the one thing he did like about his upbringing is that his family had a cabin and they could go up into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and his dad taught him how to work a shotgun and how to fly fish. And so he does have fond memories of camping and fishing and hunting with his dad and his uncle, which show up in the stories. And he passed away here by his own hand in the Warm Springs house. This is not news to many of you. But what is news to many of you is why. You know, I mean, one of the things I'm frustrated with in reading around the Hemingway books is that everyone's afraid to talk about the suicide, and I don't shy away from it. It's the very last chapter of the book. I go into great detail about the context of what was going on with him physically and psychologically. And, you know, I'll just say it now that, I mean, he wrote extensively in For Whom the Bell Tolls about what a cowardly act it is and how selfish one would have to be. And then so to do so himself, I think we need to understand what he was going through here. So some of his best days were here in Ketchum, Idaho when he first came in 39 and 40 and spent 5 summers/falls here between 1939 and 1945. And some of his worst days were here, and where he just couldn't find a way to carry on. So he died here July 2nd, 1961. So 1899 to 1961, 19 days before his 62nd birthday. And he lived a life that I don't think could be repeated if we went out and tried. He was a Italian ambulance driver in World War I at 17 years of age. Graduated from high school, and he wanted to join the army, but they wouldn't take him because he had bad eyesight. But he didn't want to miss out on the adventure of World War I, which was his language, not mine. And so he joined the Italian Ambulance Red Cross. And as he was handing out chocolates to wounded soldiers, 17-year-old Hemingway, a trench mortar shell went off, and 234 pieces of shrapnel went into his leg. And he nearly died. It was and he certainly almost lost ability to use that leg. And so here he is, 17 years old, convalescing in a hospital in Milan. And the adventure of World War I certainly had worn off. And that was his education. He was never college educated. He said that his education was war and the Kansas City newspaper, the famous style guide. And so he learned how to write by writing short journalistic pieces for the Kansas City Star, and he learned about life by going to war. He went to World War I, as I said, as an ambulance driver, but he participated in 3 other wars after that. He covered the Greco-Turkish War as a journalist. He covered the Spanish Civil War as a journalist, and obviously For Whom the Bell Tolls is the result of that experience. And he covered World War II as a war correspondent. And so he was fascinated by war. But he also, you know, he lived, this is not news to many of you, but it's worth just pondering. I mean, he lived in the expatriate, you know, halcyon days of Paris with Ezra Pound and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I mean, Ezra Pound, who was born in Haley, Idaho, about a mile from where I'm sitting right now, taught Ernest Hemingway how to write, edited his early works for him. And so he lived this incredible lifestyle with these amazing modern writers in Paris. He lived on the frontier of the Gulf Stream in Key West, in his beloved Finca Vigía, which is his house in Cuba, and here in Idaho. And what, you know, as I mentioned before, I believe I mentioned this, that the only house he ever purchased was in Sun Valley, actually in Ketchum. And Chuck Atkinson actually bought the house for him because he didn't want his name on it. And so he spent the last 2 years of his life here, 1959 and 1961. But they're all frontiers. If you think about it, his house in Key West, he was always out on his boat, the Pilar, out on the Gulf Stream, learning how to fish for marlin. He was out on the Gulf Stream in Cuba, and here in Idaho, he was out in the wilderness of the Frank Church. He was out in the wilderness of the Pacimmeroy hunting pronghorn, and he certainly was on Silver Creek and in the fields of Shoshone and Dietrich and Gooding hunting here. And he loved that idea that the hunting was pristine, and he sought out frontiers in his life, and obviously all the safaris in Africa, another frontier place that he wrote about. Just things that are popping into my head. He never wrote about Idaho. He did not write about the people here and the place. He didn't have a piece on, come to Sun Valley. The only story he ever wrote was called The Shot. It was about a pronghorn hunt over in the Pacimmeroy, which is a pretty remote valley even still today. And imagine Hemingway over there in the 1940s. But while his life is fascinating, and it is, and we're going to talk about his life, his works are equally, if not more so, fascinating. And so he left us with some of the greatest short stories of the 20th century. He certainly left us with the greatest war novels of the 20th century. And so I'm going to go into that tonight. We're going to look at some text. We'll look at the stories, and we'll also look at some text so you can see why Hemingway is so famous for his innovative writing style. But just really quickly, as Kristen mentioned, I've been how did this book come to be? As she mentioned, I'm an English teacher at the Sun Valley Community School. I've been doing it for 20 years there, but I've been teaching independent schools for 25 years. I absolutely love it. We're back in now, back in person. And one of the things I love about my job, many things, but one of the things I really love is I'm allowed to teach whatever I want. I have complete autonomy. And so I was talking to the kids. I teach a course on interpretations in law and literature. I teach a course on moral philosophy and film. I teach a course on American environmental literature. I teach a course on Shakespeare, Milton, and Blake. And so, and it just whatever strikes my fancy that year, that's a course I will teach. And then I started talking to the kids about, like, what's your favorite Hemingway story, or what's your favorite Hemingway novel? And they don't have one because they haven't read any Hemingway. They went to Ernest Hemingway Elementary School, but they don't, and you can't walk around Ketchum, Idaho without bumping into a photograph or a memorial of Ernest Hemingway. But they hadn't read any of his text. So I was like, oh, well, maybe I should teach a course on Hemingway. And so I did, and I brought up all the books that I just showed you, and it's really the greatest hits of Hemingway. We start with In Our Time. As Kristen mentioned, an incredibly innovative short story collection about his experiences in World War I. Highly recommend it. Go out and read it. It's very short. And I teach Farewell to Arms, Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Old Man in the Sea. And those were early days. I've been teaching that course for about 15 years, and that's what I would do. I would just teach the text. Students would write papers, straight up English course. And then I started realizing, like, they don't know anything about Ernest Hemingway's time here in the Valley. I would take him out to the cemetery where he's buried in Ketchum Cemetery. I would take him out to room 206, and I would show them where he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I was like, I can do better than this. And so I decided in the project, for those educators out there, in the project-based learning model, like, give kids space to produce something real and actually connected to the community. And so I was traveling around, and as I mentioned, and I'll show you some slides. Oh boy. Kristen, I can't move the slides.
You should be able to with your arrow. The arrow on your keyboard.
Okay, I'll try that. Thank you. So here's Ernest Hemingway in 1939 or 1940, not sure which year that this photo was taken, out on the porch of room 206 Sun Valley Lodge. And this is famous. This is where he was allowed to stay for free room and board. First, it was just Ernest Hemingway and his girlfriend at the time, Martha Gellhorn, but then it was his boys would come, free room and board. So there really wasn't any, you could go look at it, but there isn't any really plaque or anything about Hemingway's time here or why that room 206 is important. And oh, good, it's working now. And this is just up the road on Sun Valley Road. This is the Hemingway Memorial. You can see his bust. It's looking out at Trail Creek, looking out at the intact ecosystem of Trail Creek. Obviously, he was a great fly fisherman, and I love that he's looking out at the fish rising. He's also looking out toward the Cecil Andrews White Cloud Wilderness area, which came in 2015. I always like to think of that when I see that. And you can see there's a words at the bottom, and we'll get into that later, but that's a eulogy that Ernest Hemingway wrote about a local friend of his named Jean Van Gilder, and we'll go into that. And so what I did with the students is, as I'm moving through, there's his bust. As I'm moving through these photographs, I said, okay, here's the site. Here's Hemingway's house, right, out in Warm Springs. And I want you to create a documentary film, Ken Burns style. I'll give you all the photos related to Hemingway's time at the house. I'll give you photos inside the house, outside the house, Hemingway shooting clay pigeons off that deck. But I want you to tell the story. I want you to do some research. And I also created an archive of research for the students. And I want you to tell the story. You put it together, something creative, a documentary film, but that is unique because you selected this material, not this material. You selected this photograph, not that photograph. And you're going to present it. And so every year I would have Jenny at the Ketchum Library. I would have their staff sometimes come on campus, and the students would present their videos to the staff, and the staff would ask them questions. I actually had them go to the Sun Valley Museum of History and present their videos. And it was a really fun project. So that's project-based learning, where they actually have to produce something creative and innovative and new, and actually present it to the community and get feedback from experts in the field. And so ultimately what happened was the videos are so great, so good, and the students are so good at it that they actually exist in the Sun Valley Museum right now. If you go there, and there are a bunch of Hemingway photographs from the memorial, memorable items there, you'll see that there are QR codes, which you can scan with your phone, and you can watch the student videos. So if you're so inclined, or if you have an hour to kill and catch them, go check out the museum and watch one of the videos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But and this is what I love about this story, is that as I was listening to my students' videos and just in awe, like, okay, I couldn't produce a video like that. But as I was listening to them again and again and again, year after year, that's when it dawned on me that there's a book here, that the stories that obviously I'm teaching them the code and I want them to think about the code, but there's a book here in the sense that the stories with the local people who you spent time with, that either were able to follow the code principle or unable to follow code principle. Either way, the code was here, and he was thinking about it while he was here, and it shows up in his text. And I think that's interesting. So there's his house. I'll just go really briefly, because local people that don't know, he purchased it in 1959 from Bob Topping, who was the owner of the Yankees at the time. And if it looks familiar, it should, because it looks exactly like Sun Valley Lodge. And in fact, some of the dormers from the Sun Valley Lodge he used to build this house. However, it looks like wood, like the Sun Valley Lodge that went up for the non-Ketchum people, went up in 1936. This house is made out of concrete. It's wild, but it looks like wood. Crazy house. And so Bob Topping was definitely having too much fun in the Duchin room at Sun Valley Lodge, and was kind of treating it repeatedly as a fraternity basement. And so they kicked him out of the Duchin room, asked him not to return. And so he had plenty of money. He's like, well, I'll just build my own Sun Valley Lodge. And so you're looking at it, a true bachelor's pad. As you walk in right here, there's a drop-down movie screen. We're talking 1950s, mid-1950s. There's a drop-down movie screen. There's a bar right here, no furniture. This was just a party room. And this is where they would the party would spill out on the deck. This is the Big Wood River right in here. This is Hemingway's master bedroom. It's an amazing place, 14 and a half acres on the Big Wood River. When his fourth wife, Mary, passed away, she gave it to the Nature Conservancy, and we'll learn about why she would give it to the Nature Conservancy a little bit later. But now it's currently under the ownership or under the auspices of the community library. And so there's There's a visiting writer in residence program that can stay here for a month. Terry Tempest Williams, an amazing writer, was at the Hemingway house, and she puts on workshops with kids, and it's just it's a wonderful place, and it's now being used more than ever. And here's his view from his bedroom window. You're looking out at the Boulder white clouds, and so this was, I showed you the master bedroom. This is actually the bedroom behind. And so Hemingway, when he was writing, if he was working on a project, he would sleep in a separate bedroom than Mary, because he liked to get up right at dawn and stand at that typewriter and write. And so he didn't want to bother her by doing that. But one thing I love about this view is he's looking out at the Boulder white clouds, which I mentioned are 3 wilderness areas now. And this one is called the Hemingway Boulder Wilderness now. It came in 2015. And so you can see the quote at the top. It's being blocked by some of my options here, but you'd have to come from a test tube and think like a machine to not engrave all this in your head so that you never lose it. Ernest Hemingway said that on top of Galena Summit after a hunt. I think that's a great quote. And there's a Hemingway. I'll go more quickly here, but so all students are making documentary videos about this. There's a Hemingway Monument down at Silver Creek. I highly recommend that you go there. There's a bench next to it, and it has the epigraph, "The sun also rises there. One generation passes away, another generation comes, but the earth abides forever." Why is that interesting to me? Why did they choose that? Well, it took a generation. It took his son, Jack, who spent most of his life here and moved here and his family here to catch him. Jack became the Idaho Fish and Game Commissioner. This is Ernest Hemingway's first son. And he was integral in working with the Nature Conservancy to get Silver Creek preserved, and working with the local ranchers and earning easements. And so this intact ecosystem, this amazing blue ribbon trout stream and waterfowl hunting place is preserved forever by the next generation, part of the Hemingway legacy. There's his grave. It's a flat stone. He's buried next to his 4th wife, Mary, and he's surrounded by his family. He's surrounded by Jack and his wife, granddaughter Margot, and Gregory, his other son. His 3rd son, Patrick, is still alive in Montana. And so, but you're probably looking at it like, what's the deal with the coins? Every time I go to the Ernest Hemingway grave, there's something new to check out. People leave typewriters, people leave, pens and notebooks, and people write them letters. And, this is a pilgrimage for a lot of Hemingway aficionados. And it's always a fascinating grave to go see, because it's always different. People leave whiskey bottles and poker chips from Havana. It's really cool. But the coins are interesting, which I had to go do some research. Hemingway was not a commissioned soldier. He volunteered as an ambulance driver for the Italian Red Cross. Technically, he wasn't, ever enrolled as in any of the armed forces for the United States. A lot of people don't know that about him. But the reason why that you see the pennies and the nickels and the dimes is because if you visit a soldier's grave, you leave a penny. If you went in boot camp with the soldier, you leave a nickel. If you served in war with the soldier, you leave a dime. And if you were there when he was killed in combat, he or she was killed in combat, then you leave a quarter. And so and that happened during the Vietnam War as a way to pay for some of the graves. But people leave it recognizing that Hemingway was a soldier, or at least thinking that he was, but he wasn't. But it's an interesting story. And then if you pan out, and there's his grave next to Mary, Ernest on the right and Mary's on the left. If you pan out, and you'll see that these other gravestones are Taylor Williams, Gene Van Gilder's back here. His doctor, George Sagers, is over here. And Bud Purdy, the Atkinsons are over here. And so if you pan out, and I do take my students to the Ketchum Cemetery, and you walk around, you see that not only was he buried next to his family, he was buried next to who he called the family, which were the hunting guys. Gene Van Gilder, Taylor Williams, Bud Purdy, Tilly and Lloyd Arnold. So he's still surrounded by the people that he spent the most time with. And so even in death, Ernest Hemingway is telling us a story about his life. So that's how it came to be. And so that's really the book is really simple in the sense that it's 10 chapters, 10 code principles. For each code principle, I define it. I show how it shows up in the local stories. And then I go through all of the texts where this principle shows up. And so you really get to know what self-assess means by reading the local stories in the beginning and then going in as deep as you want, as far as you want, into the analysis of the moments in the stories in which characters either are or are not self-assessing. And so here's the code. This is not, I can't claim authority for this. I can't say that I was the first one to think of the Hemingway heroic code. I was not. In fact, you may remember that your English teacher might have mentioned it in high school to you. But one of the things that frustrated me with all the books I've read on Hemingway and literary criticism is while they mention the code, they never really codify what the code means. And so there's the idea of grace under pressure, right? And you think of Robert Jordan at the end of From When the Bell Tolls, holding off the fascist nationalist soldiers so that his girlfriend Maria and Pilar can escape, knowing that he's going to die in doing so, but completing that task well, staying in the moment, grace under pressure. Sure, absolutely. Stiff upper lip, commit to a cause even when, or especially when you can't necessarily achieve the end goal you're trying to achieve. These are things that many critics wrote about, and Robert Penn Warren in particular, novelist and critic, wrote about. But the thing that I really wanted to share with my students, because I'm interested in you as readers in thinking about these things. So what does it mean to complete tasks well? What does it mean to value mentors? Who are the experts in your life about the things that you care about? Are you spending enough time with them? Are you learning from them? What does it mean to be part of a community? What does it mean to take responsibility for wrongs? And I wish we had more time and I could go into value nature as an ethical arena, because that's a fascinating idea in Hemingway. The idea that in nature, the hunting and the fishing really reveals your character. Instead of taking people out on a round of golf and see if they're cheating or not, like Hemingway would take you out hunting and see how you carried yourself in the field hunting, and he would know who you were as a person. And you can read the rest. Obviously, the last chapter, Avoid Self-Pity, is the chapter about his suicide. And so you would say that, well, straight away, Phil, what's the deal? Yeah, he has all these great code principles, and he created these characters like Santiago in Old Man and the Sea, like Robert Jordan from The Bell Tolls, like Frederick Henry eventually in Farewell to Arms, Jake Barnes eventually in The Sun Also Rises, and many characters in his short stories that exhibit these code principles, but he failed to do so in his own life. And I think that's a fair criticism. And I lean into it in the book. And I think that it's interesting to have these aspirational principles and then have the actual life of Hemingway. And so I talk about this a little bit in the book, but one of the descendants of Hemingway is Cormac McCarthy, who's a contemporary author. Many of you are familiar with him, and All the Pretty Horses, The Road, The Crossing, No Country for Old Men. Don't judge him by the movies, read his books. So Cormac McCarthy is definitely a Hemingway descendant. And Cormac McCarthy has this great line that helped me lean into what I was trying to say in the book about that Hemingway doesn't always live up to these code principles. And he said, the world is quite ruthless in choosing between the dream and the reality, even when we will not do the choosing. Between the wish and the thing, the world lies waiting. And as a Hemingway scholar and as a Hemingway aficionado, Cormac McCarthy, I think, is paying homage to Ernest Hemingway in that way, is that, yeah, of course, these are aspirational principles. Of course, embrace the present and avoid self-pity and find faith in love. Why couldn't he do that at the very end of his life? And I think that's where the humanity comes in. That, yes, these are the principles that he developed again and again as characters. These were the ways of behaving in the world that he wanted to exhibit and manifest day to day, but he often fell short of being able to do so. Obviously, number 6, he had 4 wives, and he moved on. Let's just be clear. I'm sure I'm going to get some questions on this, but he moved on in each relationship prior to the ending of that relationship. And I think that comes from a vulnerability in Hemingway, this macho, this guy getting in fights all the time, this hunter, this man fascinating with war and big game hunting, marlin fishing, right? You know, he gave up trout fishing and went marlin fishing. It's more manly. But he was vulnerable in the sense that he did not want he knew when the marriage was over, he knew his wife was leaving him, and so he would move on to the next relationship before it was officially ended. And he certainly did that here with Martha Gellhorn. So 1939, when he was invited to come to Sun Valley, he was experiencing a bitter divorce with his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. And he took it very hard. But he had this affair with Martha Gellhorn going on and had moved on in that relationship. Okay, so we're just gonna do the ones in yellow. We're gonna look at complete tasks well, and value mentors and community, and self-assess and take responsibility for wrongs. And believe it or not, that's more than enough. I do like this. Hemingway wrote this in Death in the Afternoon. And this is on my website, the course site that I teach. I lead every opening class with this for the kids, for the students. And he wrote, you know, there are some things which cannot be learned quickly. In time, which is all we have, must be paid for their acquiring. They're the very simplest things. Because it takes a man's life to know them, the little new that each man gets from life is very costly, and the only heritage he has to leave. And if we go back to that slide and thinking about, okay, what does he mean? Like some simple things about how to behave in the world come to you once you've experienced them, once you've experienced life, and you go back to the code. These are very simple things, right? Take responsibility for wrongs, find faith and love, embrace the present, speak through actions. But it took a lifetime to realize how important they were to him. And luckily we have his heritage of those ideas, of those principles in his novels, and I would argue in some of the local Idaho stories. And so here's something new that you won't find in any book, which is Hemingway's family crest. No one has ever written about it. Luckily I get to do tours of the house with the students nearly every year. We get to walk around, and it's always a memorable experience. I always find something new, you know, his fishing net or his tennis racket or his snowshoes. But this is on the back of his leather chair, his Cuban leather chair at the writing desk at the foot of his bed in the master bedroom. It's also on his suitcase, his leather suitcase. And so it's a family crest. It's a way to mark his belongings. And the way I see it, it's mountains, a arrowhead, and flowing water or rivers, obviously encapsulated in a circle. And so it's a river mountain ecosystem with a native at the center. And I like to think of this as sort of a visual manifestation of what Ernest Hemingway was trying to do with his code. He was trying to impose an order on the chaos of his life. He was trying to create an equilibrium by these mutually enhancing code principles that he, I think, shows really well in this family crest: mountains, rivers, and being native at the center of that ecosystem. So I write a little bit about that in the book, if you want to go a little bit deeper into that. Before I go into what constitutes a code hero, it begs the question, you know, why does one need a code, right? This sounds kind of dated, right? Why does one need to try to live up to these aspirational principles or ways of behaving in the world? Well, I just think it's a great idea. I think that I love virtue ethics. I teach Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics to the students. I think it's really important to have these virtues on board. But I also think you need to understand Ernest Hemingway's life. I mean, he, as I mentioned, you know, nearly lost his leg at age 17. And he writes about the brutal atrocities that he saw in World War I. The character in Our Time, sorry, spoiler alert, but Nick Adams is shot in the spine, loses control of his legs, and he turns over and he watches his best friend Rinaldi die. I mean, that's a tiny little paragraph in Our Time. And in Farewell to Arms, if I were to pick up any novel of Hemingway that captures a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, it's Farewell to Arms, and it's an easy read. He has his leg blown off. He watches his friend Pacini have his leg blown off and die, bleed out. He plugs the holes in Imo's bullet that goes through his chest and out through his cheek as best he can, and he watches Imo die in his arms, and he realizes that it's from friendly fire. And in the famous chapter of the retreat at Caporetto, where the Italians are retreating from the Austrian front, and he finally gets to the Tagliamento River, and he realizes the military police, the Italian battle police, are questioning each officer as to why they aren't with their soldiers, and then killing them on the spot for deserting their soldiers as a way, in their mind, to preserve order in a retreat. And so Hemingway didn't actually see the retreat of Caporetto, but he saw things like that. And so, just from reading around his biographies and reading around his novels, you get the sense that the chaos of war caused him to want to have a very ordered life when he returned back, and he wanted to control how he was behaving in the world, because he believed that the world was full of disorder. So that's why I think that crest makes a lot of sense. So what's a code hero? I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. It can be a hero or heroine. A lot of people think that Hemingway is just a masculine writer writing for men. I strongly disagree with that. I think that some of the best characters in his novels and short stories are women. The most admirable people in the stories and the novels are Catherine Barclay, Jig in Hills Like White Elephants. Those are two women you probably know from your reading of Hemingway. But basically, a coded hero is one who's destroyed but not defeated. So emotionally destroyed, physically destroyed, psychologically destroyed, as Hemingway was, but not ultimately one who gives up. I know there's a little bit of irony in there. One who lives by code principles, commits to a cause, even if the cause is futile. I already mentioned some of the other ones, Grace Under Pressure. All right, so let's get into it. So there's his code. His life was surrounded by thinking about how one's character manifests most obviously when your life is threatened. And so this is not a newsflash to people out there. He was fascinated with bullfighting. I mean, he spent a lot of time in Spain. There's the bullfighter Ordonez right there, who he brought to his Warm Springs home. So Ordonez spent some time in Ketchum, Idaho. He was fascinated by the ritual of it. He was fascinated by the pageantry of it. But most importantly, to our purposes tonight, he was fascinated with bullfighting, because if you didn't do it well, you died. And if you weren't careful in the bull ring, and you got gored, which he writes about frequently, not only in Death in the Afternoon, but in Our Time, bad bullfighters didn't make it. And he's very graphic in descriptions of watching that. On Death in the Afternoon, it's not just death for the bull in the afternoon, it can be death for the matadors. And so he was really interested in these endeavors, bullfighting, in which life is threatened, in which character manifests. Big game hunting. Many of you maybe were taught in high school The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber. If you haven't, go read it. It's amazing. Where that character had a short, happy life, and he only lived for 30 seconds because he was a coward his entire life. You find out who people are in these moments. He shoots a lion. He doesn't want to go into the bush and finish off the lion. Robert Wilson, the hunting guide, has to go finish him off for him. And so there's a obvious code in hunting when your life is threatened. Boxing. He was a boxer. He got in many fights here, drinking too much at Trail Creek Cabin, in the casino, and the Sawtooth Club. But he was more often than not the winner of those fights. But there's a way to box when you're just, practicing for training purposes, to do it well, to shield yourself. and to honor the person that you're training with, so you don't, damage them too much. So there's a written code. There's a code in war. Hemingway famously wrote in an Esquire article in 1936, "There is no hunting like the hunting of a man." And so there are written explicit, code principles, etiquette at war, rules of engagement. And so those are the things he writes about, and those are obvious. Like coming into this presentation tonight, you knew that Hemingway was fascinated when life is threatened in the bull ring, in the boxing ring, in the safaris in Africa, and at war. But what I became interested in, no shocker to those that know me, are the kind of the unspoken code, the unspoken etiquette that's involved in fly fishing. He learned how to fly fish from his father. There he is, very young age, early teenage years, catching and releasing a trout in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. There's a way to fish. There's a way to fish well and not fish well. There's a way to catch and release fish well. And it's not something that's written down anywhere. You just learn through experience and being taught by others. He was an incredible big marlin fisherman, and he was recognizing the impact they were having on the marlin fishing industry in the Gulf Stream. And so he imposed his own etiquette, ways of behaving out there on the Gulf Stream by not fishing during spawning season and instituting catch and release with the marlin fishermen that he was fishing with. Ultimately, this is kind of wild, in my research, I found out that Hemingway became the vice president of the International Fish and Game, and he instituted those unspoken etiquette about how to treat marlin well, so if there are marlin to catch, into law. He closed the fishing down during spawning season for marlin, and he instituted catch and release in certain areas where the marlin were decimated. And then my favorite one is his unspoken code in writing. And this is one of my favorite photographs of Ernest Hemingway. Look at the editing. And look at the intensity with which he's editing his own work. And this is something that he did to himself. He often told his first wife, Hadley, it's just people have no idea how difficult it is to do what I'm doing in writing. And that is this. He only wrote in images. He only wrote in images and dialogue. What was going on in modern poetry at the time was, thanks to Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams and others, was this concept of no ideas, but the thing itself. Do not give us the theme. Do not tell us what to think. Do not tell us how to feel. Just give us the thing. And give us the thing described well enough in detail that the idea will carry through. And so that's what he's doing there. And he had his own language for it. Ezra Pound called it Imagism. That means writing in images, that an image can be an emotion and an idea in an instant of time. But he called it the iceberg. And he wrote in a letter, he said, I always try to write on the principle of the iceberg. There's 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. Anything you can eliminate only strengthens your iceberg. And so addition by subtraction. And so sometimes he cut his iceberg so much, it doesn't work. And he would admit that. But I would say even his greatest novels are icebergs. Does Robert Jordan actually kill Lieutenant Berendo at the end of Fernando Beltones? And does Robert Jordan die in the process? Do Pilar and Maria make it? Right? He doesn't tell us. He just leaves us with his heart beating loudly on the pine forest floor as he waits for Lieutenant Berendo to approach. But we have enough of it to know that he does do it successfully. But certainly he wrote in his short stories on the tip of the iceberg. He would just give you dialogue. He would just give you images. And if you want to see a great example of that, it's literally a page and a half. It's called Hills Like White Elephants, a conversation between a couple about whether or not they're going to have a baby. Fascinating. Go check it out. And here's Robert Penn Warren. And some of it's cut off for me because I'm looking at I might reduce your videos. So he wrote this. And again, Robert Penn Warren is the one who came up with the code idea. I just made it more concrete. So he wrote, in Hemingway, individuals maintain an ideal of themselves, formulated or unformulated, by which they've lived. They represent some notion of a code, some notion of honor, which distinguishes them from people who merely follow their random impulses and who are by consequence messy. In the God-abandoned world of modernity, and that's an important line, after World War I, in the God-abandoned world of modernity, man can realize an ideal meaning only insofar as he can define and maintain the code. And so there's a famous essay that just makes me think of what as I'm reading that. It's called The Religion of Man. And it's a great essay about how Hemingway found faith in individuals who could live by these mutually enhancing code principles. He replaced his faith in God. He was raised a Congregationalist. He was basically the version of an altar boy in the Congregationalist church. His parents were deeply religious. He struggled with religion. He became a Catholic with his third wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. But he struggled with faith. But what he didn't struggle with faith in were the people who exhibited the code principles. So there you have it. Homage to Robert Penn Warren. Oh, here we go. So really quickly, Hemingway also lived through a pandemic 100 years ago. Believe it or not, 50 million people died, which is a shocking number. And in 1918, he's convalescing in a hospital in Milan, falling in love with Agnes von Krauske, the British nurse for whom who he bases Catherine Barclay on, and for in Farewell to Arms. He receives this letter from his dad. I mean, you got to remember, Ernest Hemingway nearly lost his life and certainly nearly lost his leg. And in this rather boring letter from his dad, Dr. Hemingway, Clarence Hemingway, he says to his son at the very end, signs off, he says, "Goodbye, sport. Read your Field and Stream and dream of Walloon Lake." And that probably doesn't mean much to you guys, and why would Phil share that? But it means a lot to me, because if you do read Field and Stream, of which I do, it's about how to fish and hunt well. It's about how to track animals, where they're going to be at what time of the day, when the good fishing is, how to fly fish, what flies to use at certain times of the year on certain streams. And so Walloon Lake was where they had a cabin where he learned how to hunt and fish with his dad. And so why do I share that with you? And I think in a very subtle way, his dad is saying to him, we'll get through this. You're going to get to Walloon Lake. You're going to come home. And I think there's also a little piece in there, and we're gonna fish well. We're gonna hunt well, and it's gonna be restorative. It's gonna be edifying for you. So I just wanted to share that with you. So complete tasks well. Pretty simple, but there's some things that Hemingway adds to this idea of pouring oneself into the task of whatever you're doing. Make sure you're doing it well. Why? Because it's not for others, not even for the task itself. But because it's edifying, because it strengthens the self. And so, but he also came up with some ideas here, like the negation of apprehension. When you're doing something really well, you are unaware of what you're doing. And there's a sudden precipitation into action. But as an athlete, or even writing for me, I'm not aware of what I'm doing when I'm writing. It's just coming. So adhering to unspoken rules and being an instrument to your duty. And so I just want to share a couple stories with you about complete tasks well in Idaho that are developed more in the book. As I said, he came in 1939 with 12 chapters for whom the bell tolls. And he was coming off, you got to put this in context. So he was coming off of 3 really bad books. He wrote, in my view, and some people can disagree with me, but Death in the Afternoon is about bullfighting, nonfiction book about bullfighting. It was not a bestseller. He wrote To Have and to Have Not, a story about rum running in Key West, not a critically acclaimed novel. And he wrote about African safari called Green Hills of Africa. Not a great piece. Some good passages in there, but not great. And so that's coming out of In Our Time, and coming out of The Sun Also Rises, and coming out of Farewell to Arms. By 1929, he was famous as a writer could be. Recognizable image, obviously. That's why Sun Valley Resort wanted to have him, because they wanted to use his photo as publicity photos to attract people to come to Sun Valley by rail to recreate in the summer and fall. There are pictures of him playing tennis. There are pictures of him fly fishing. There's pictures of him hunting ducks. pictures of him in the canoe on Silver Creek. And so with those photos, as I mentioned, he had free room and board. But when he came here in 39, bitter divorce with his second wife, Pauline, and really from the critical perspective, washed up. He had a spurt of creativity, and it's unfortunate that he keeps writing. And you can imagine how that went over with Hemingway. And so he's 12. He had spent a few years in the Spanish Civil War with Martha Gellhorn, who was also a war correspondent and journalist and a novelist in her own right. I'll just say this: if you haven't seen Hemingway and Gellhorn on HBO, it's an HBO series, HBO film. You should go see it. It really captures the relationship well. So he comes here and he needs to write For Whom the Bell Tolls. And that's a book that has, 47 chapters. And so he was on chapter 12. He would wake up at 5:30 every morning in room 206. He would get up, stand at the typewriter, and he would write, whether it was good or bad or otherwise, he would write. And he wouldn't stop writing until noon. And he wouldn't allow himself to go recreate. He wouldn't allow himself to go hunt down in Silver Creek or Dietrich or Shoshone if he hadn't met his word count. He was meticulous about I have to have a certain number of words in order for me then to go on and enjoy the day. But things were going well here. You can imagine in 39 and in 40, he was editing his book and finishing up some of the chapters. And so he famously, after a great morning of writing, he went and had lunch at the Alpine restaurant, which is now Whiskey Jack's in Ketchum. And he told Bud Purdy, I've written 1,000 words this morning and they're worth $1 a word. I love that. And that afternoon they went hunting, and I'll give you that image. Oops. Hang on a second. There he is hunting with the black lab bullet, and he's down in the Littlewood River with Bud Purdy, and they're walking along this tributary, and 3 mallards get up. And for those who don't hunt, you only have 3 shotgun shells. You're only legally allowed to hunt with 3 shotgun shells in your gun. And bang, 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 Hemingway gets all 3 ducks with 1 swing of the gun and 3 pulls of the trigger. And, surrounded by this guy, Bud Purdy, who could appreciate how difficult that was. And so here he is writing well, things are flowing, and then spending the afternoon on Silver Creek, on the Littlewood River, hunting well. That's why, in my view, between 39 and 45, it's actually 39 between 1939 and 1947, he spent 5 summers and falls here, escaping the hurricane season. It's going on right now, escaping the hurricane season, coming to Cuba. Why he associated the best parts of his life with his time here in Ketchum in the Wood River Valley. And why I think in the last 2 years of his life, 59 to 61, 3 years of his life, he lived here. He was trying to recreate that feeling that he once had, and obviously was unable to do so. There's the cover of the book. I love that, and I had to pay a lot of money for that cover because Robert Capa, who's a famous Spanish Civil War photographer, took it, and they are well copyrighted. But yeah, I just love that because you can see his grin on his face, and he sort of is just on couldn't be happier. In that famous line that Bud Purdy said about Ernest Hemingway was, after he shot those 3 mallards, you could have given him $1 million and he wouldn't have been any happier. And there he is with his limited ducks. There's Taylor Williams, local Sun Valley resort hunting guide and fly fishing guide. He invented a fly called the Renegade, which is used throughout the world in fly fishing. But here he is with a pronghorn. They're hunting over in the Persimmon. He had his 3 sons with him. And Lloyd Arnold, who was also a hunting guide, who wrote a book on Hemingway called High in the Wild. They were all over there, and they found pronghorn are weird. You come upon them, and then you'll flush them, and then they'll go to the next ridge and they'll stay. And you'll walk up toward them, and then they'll go to the next ridge and they'll stay. Like, they are not smart enough to keep going. However, they've come upon some pronghorn, and Lloyd was the photographer for Sun Valley Resort, and the sun caught the lens of his camera or the ball of his camera, or whatever it was, and spooked the pronghorn, and Hemingway swears at him, and on a dead run, 20 yards, according to Ernest Hemingway, and corroborated by the people that were there. Runs and on a dead stop at 20 yards, puts the rifle to his shoulder and kills the pronghorn right in the shoulder from 275 yards out, which is a remarkable shot. And that, again, as I mentioned, the only story he ever wrote about Idaho was called The Shot. And he claimed that was the best shot of his life. But again, completing tasks well. He always associated his time in Idaho with writing fluidly and then hunting well and surrounding himself with people who would appreciate. So how's it connect to the stories? How's it connect to the novels? For those who haven't read For Whom the Bell Tolls, it's an incredible work. I think it's important to read while you're here, since he was writing it here. But basically, it's Spanish Civil War. His main character, Robert Jordan, is a Spanish professor from University of Montana up in Missoula, and he volunteers to be a part of some of the brigades that went over to help the Republicans, who were called the peasant farmers, resist this nationalist fascist regime. And so he's embedded with guerrilla fighters in the mountains, and his job is to blow this bridge to prevent the nationalists and the fascists from coming over. And so here's a paragraph from the Bell Tolls. What if they were killed tomorrow? What did it matter as long as they did the bridge properly? That was all they had to do tomorrow. So he's talking about the they there is the people he's with, these people he deeply admires, these Spanish guerrilla fighters. So now as he worked, Robert Jordan, placing, bracing, wedging, lashing tight with wire, thinking only of demolition, working fast and skillfully as a surgeon works, if you wait and hold them up even a little while or just get the officer, that can make all the difference. One thing done well can make, he leaves it off, but all the difference. And so again, there's that classic Hemingway, committing yourself to the task at hand, regardless of whether or not you're going to achieve the end goal. And if there's any war that was over before it started, it's the Spanish Civil War. They didn't have a chance. They were fighting with secondhand rifles and sickles and scythes and pitchforks, and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were bombing them with planes and tanks. So, but again, perfect scenario for Hemingway to develop a character who commits to the cause, commits to blowing the bridge well, regardless of whether or not they're going to win the war, which they didn't. And here he is, again, he's a young man, but it makes me think of the very end of In Our Time, Nick Adams, one of the most famous characters in Hemingway's works. Again, I mentioned he was shot in the spine in that text, watched his best friend Rinaldi die, saw firing squads, he describes in great detail, but here he is coming back to America after the war. And what's the first thing that the character does when he gets back to basically Oak Park, Illinois, if you will? He gets on a train and goes fly fishing in the Upper Peninsula. And he's fly fishing, and he's thinking about how he doesn't like to fish with people who don't know how to fish. He doesn't like to fish streams where he sees dead trout floating up in the streams, because people don't know how to handle trout well when they're catching and releasing. And so here's a passage from the very end of In Our Time. He held the trout never still with his moist right hand while he unhooked the barb from its mouth and then dropped him back in the stream. He is Nick Adams, wet his hand so he would not disturb the delicate mucus that covered the trout. And so this is something you learn from experience. You never handle a trout out of the water at great lengths of time. That's the most common cause of death for trout. You don't handle them with a dry hand, because everybody knows who fishes that they have this mucus layer that wards off disease. And I think it's interesting to think about that. Why would Nick Adams or / Ernest Hemingway so admire a protective barrier on a creature, a protective layer on the trout that keeps out disease in the world? And it makes me think of his code. It makes me think of things that Ernest Hemingway was doing to keep the chaos at bay. And so certainly he's wetting his hand in this photograph, and he has his character to complete that task well. And there's a famous photograph, Sun Valley Resort. It's right below Magic Dam. about 10 miles south of where I am right now with 2 giant rainbow trout. And I'm going to skip one of those stories because I've been talking a lot. And let's get into Sun Also Rises. So Sun Also Rises, for those that don't remember from high school, is post-World War I book. And really just, if you want to read a book that's not about war, Sun Also Rises is your book. And it's often about drinking and the roaring 20s in Paris. And Sun Also Rises is your book, but it's full of codeless characters. It's got the main character, Jake Barnes, is in love with Lady Brett Ashley, who has about 5 other lovers. And so really it takes him the entire novel to finally get the courage to say that he's done, that Jake Barnes is done with Lady Brett Ashley. But why do I bring this up? Well, one of the individuals that Lady Brett Ashley falls in love with is Pedro Romero, a bullfighter. And so they've traveled to Spain for the running of the bulls, and they're going to the bullfight. And so Pedro Romero, prior to this paragraph, had gotten in a fight the night before with Robert Cohn, because Robert Cohn had slept with Lady Brett Ashley and he was bragging about it. Robert Cohn was a boxer trained at Princeton. And so while Pedro's a great bullfighter, matador, he wasn't a great fighter. And so he lost the fight badly in front of everybody. And so here he is the next day in the bull ring. Pedro Romero's bullfighting gave real emotion because he kept the absolute purity of line in his movements and always quietly and calmly let the horns pass him close each time. Romero had the old thing, the holding of his purity of line through the maximum of exposure, while he dominated the bull by making him realize he was unattainable, while he prepared him for the killing. And so this is Pedro Romero knowing that he's embarrassed himself in front of his who he thinks is his new girlfriend, Lady Brett Ashley, who he actually proposes marriage to, and she refuses. But here he is, that purity of line, maximum exposure, dominating the bull by making him realize that he, the matador, was unattainable and not afraid. And so there's that precipitation into action. There's that negation of apprehension that constitutes completing tasks well. And this also bleeds into another code principle called self-assess, right? So be aware of the principles upon which you act. And so here he is, next paragraph. Never once did Pedro Romero look up. He made it stronger that way. And he did it for himself too, as well as for her, Lady Brett Ashley, because he did not look up to ask if it pleased. He did it all for himself inside. And it strengthened him. He gained by it all through the afternoon. He didn't want to be carried on people's shoulders, but they held him and lifted him. And he looked around apologetically. And Lady Brett Ashley remarks, he's wiped out that damn comb. And so this is very explicit, unlike, the tip of the iceberg writing. He's really giving it to you here. And that is that Pedro Romero is self-assessing. He's doing what he does best well. Why? For himself, because it strengthens his sense of self. It did please Lady Brett Ashley. It did please others, but he didn't want to be carried on people's shoulders. He wanted to do it for himself. I think Hemingway was doing that while he was here between 39 and 47. And so there's self-assess. Don't overvalue false praise, of which we get, or meritless condemnation. Value your awareness of the principles upon which you act. And this is one of my favorite code principles. And for those that came to the community library talk, here's a new local story about under the rubric of self-assess. So here's Robert Capa. Some of you may know him. He's a famous war photographer. And again, he took the photograph of Hemingway. That's the cover of my book. Robert Capa covered the Spanish Civil War. He covered World War II. He has some of the most iconic photographs. Here's one of them. That's a Republican soldier, the peasants, the farmers. This was one of the most iconic war photographs of all time, but certainly of the Spanish Civil War. I mean, he's literally captured the man being shot in the chest and killed instantly. Look how close Robert Capa is to him. So Kappa, Hemingway liked to share, so he brought Kappa out to the Wood River Valley. And Robert Kappa, I guess, had his expenses paid by Life magazine. They said he would do a spread on Ernest Hemingway hunting in the Wood River Valley. And obviously you can see there's his third wife, Martha Gellhorn. And so there it is, the Hemingways in Sun Valley, January 6, 1941. And in this spread, I actually don't own this Life magazine, but I have pawed through it. And you get to this. And this is a photograph that Robert Kappa took of Ernest Hemingway, wringing the neck of a pheasant. So he hunted pheasants down in Dietrich and Shoshone, Gooding. Back when, you couldn't walk 10 feet in these fields without flushing a pheasant. Can't, not so much anymore. But under this photograph, it says, "Dead shot Hemingway. In 10 days of hunting, he never missed a bird." And this goes into Life magazine, one of the most popular magazines of the time in 1941. Hemingway was furious. So for those that don't get why he would be furious, I mean, if at best you're a 50, 60% success rate when you're hunting waterfowl, when you're hunting pheasants. And so, anybody who had any clue about hunting would know that that is just bragging. That is overstating that he never missed a bird. And so he said, well, next time I see Kappa, I'm going to stick a boot in his gut and lift him sideways. But the story's not over. So this Life magazine makes it around. And Averell Harriman on the left, the chief of the Union Pacific, the reason why Sun Valley Resort exists. And just really briefly on that, there was a Union Pacific line going through Shoshone. For those that don't know, he, encouraged them to do a spur line into Ketchum, which was really just a sheep herding town at that point. The mining had all played out. Originally, that spur was there for mining purposes, and then it was used for transporting sheep. However, Averell Harriman, decided that Sun Valley was a great place for the first destination ski resort. As many of you know, created the first chairlift in the world on Rude Mountain. And but here's Ernest Hemingway and Averell Harriman, the founder of Sun Valley Ski Resort, and they're having a cocktail at the Sun Valley Lodge. And this is post 1941, after the Life magazine had come out, and Averell says to Ernest Hemingway, how'd it go today? And he's like, oh, it was good, really good duck hunting weather. It was, cloudy, misty, lots of birds moving. Got a few, but missed most, something like that. And Averell Harriman says to him, well, I'm disappointed in you. I thought you were dead shot Hemingway. Never missed a bird. And Hemingway later recalled and told Lloyd Arnold that, for once in my life, I kept my mouth shut and didn't say anything. And so really, why do I bring that up? He knew at best 50, 60% of the time he was successful as a hunter. He knew that was good. And he also knew at best 50 or 60% of the time he was good with his stories and his novels. But he was willing to write frequently enough to be able to hit the mark 50% of the time. Just so people aren't confused, and I don't want to give any false information out there, this is a photograph of Ernest Hemingway backcountry skiing in Austria. This is not, he never skied in Sun Valley. He spent most of his times in the late summer, August, and falls hunting. It wasn't until later in his life that he spent overwintered. At that point, he wasn't skiing. So there it is. What Hemingway would have loved to have be a caption in Life magazine would be this, is what he wrote in a letter. He said, "The only reward is that which is within ourselves. Publicity, admiration, and adulation are worthless." I love that. It's just something I encountered in my reading around of his letters. So value mentors and community are another code principle, and certainly he was doing that here, and certainly that shows up in his texts like Old Man and the Sea. What does that mean? Develop and maintain faith in others who embody and exhibit principles of the code, and seek out a community of people who do so. And as I already mentioned, and here's a photograph of Taylor Williams These are these are the labs from Sun Valley Resort. And that's Gary Cooper, a lifelong friend who starred in the 1941 film version of For Whom the Bell Tolls. And so, as already mentioned, he referred to the hunting guides and their wives and their friends and the doctors and the Atkinsons as his, Anita Gray, the Gray family as the family. And so I think that's really telling because as I mentioned earlier, he did not have a close connection with his own family. He never went back to Oak Park, Illinois. The only time he went back to Oak Park, Illinois was after his own father committed suicide when his father was when Ernest Hemingway was 29 years old. He drove all the way back from Key West to Oak Park, Illinois to clean up the mess. He didn't like his mother. He had a very challenging upbringing, according to Ernest Hemingway. And so the call to family of the people he hung out with at Hemingway, I think is really telling. He had a familial feeling here. And I want to share with you a quote. Give me 1 second. A lot of people say, Ernest Hemingway was intolerable. He was quick-tempered. All of these things, and all of that is true. But I think one of the interesting things about, here it is. One of the interesting things about Hemingway while he was here between 39 and 47, and in the later years, mid-50s and the last years, 59 and 61, was that they couldn't believe the biographies about him. He was on his best behavior here in Ketchum, Idaho. And here's his doctor, George Saviors. He wrote this in a letter. He said, my best assessment of Ernest Hemingway is to judge him by the company he kept. Take all those people who were family to him, the Arnolds, Tilly and Lloyd Arnold, Bud and Ruth Purdy, the Williamses, Taylor Williams, and all of these people are buried next to Ernest Hemingway in the Ketchum Cemetery. He went on to say they were all very intelligent, they all had a quality of humility, and they were competent and not self-effacing. Hemingway, and he goes on to say, Hemingway's built-in bullshit detector made him intolerant of phony people. And that's a famous, line from Hemingway that you had to have an internal bullshit detector to be a good writer to see when you're bullshitting the reader. But he also, I think tellingly here, Dr. George Saviors applies it to Hemingway's sense of who he wanted to spend time with. And so there you go. Quick story about mentors and community. Taylor Williams, just to go back so you can see Taylor Williams there on the right. There he is with Martha Gellhorn, becoming a mentor, teaching her how to hunt. There he is with Gregory on Kilpatrick Bridge, teaching him how to hunt on Silver Creek. But Taylor Williams was, as I mentioned, the head guide at Sun Valley Resort and the vice president of Union Pacific. His last name is Ashby, and his friends wanted to go on a pheasant hunt. And so Taylor Williams took him down to go on a pheasant hunt, and they're out in the fields and they get out of the cars, and immediately Vice President Ashby and the other clients, they all just run sort of pell-mell into the field shooting at pheasants. And Taylor Williams goes back to the car, slams the door, rolls the windows shut, and it takes them a while to realize that their guide isn't anywhere around, but they come back to, eventually Ashby comes back to the car and knocks on the window and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And Taylor Williams told him, if that's how you guys are going to hunt, all, helter-skelter, and I'm going to get caught in the crossfire, then I don't want anything to do with it. You're either going to let me place you out properly and do this well, or we're not going to do it at all. Well, the vice president didn't like that very much, and that was it for Taylor Williams. They went back, and obviously the vice president reported that to Sun Valley Resort, and Taylor Williams was immediately demoted from being considered head guide at Sun Valley Resort. Ernest Hemingway was disgusted by that. He deeply admired that Taylor Williams was trying to guide well and teach these individuals how to hunt well. And so prior to that, every correspondence that Hemingway had, any letter or any memorandum he wrote, he would always sign it Sun Valley. After that incident, every single correspondence that Hemingway wrote from this area was signed Ketchum. And for those that live here know the difference. There's Sun Valley with the tourists, the second homeowners, people who only live here for a couple weeks at a time. And then there are people who live in Ketchum and Haley and Bellevue, who are the locals. And I always like that story. I just think that's a fun one to share. And so really quickly, Farewell to Arms shows up. There are a lot of mentors throughout the novels. And again, these are the stories that my students are telling in these documentary videos. And then we look at them in the text. And so here's Frederick Henry, who's escaped World War I after nearly being killed by the battle police after retreating from Caporetto, nearly dying himself and watching his mates die, basically. He is on a lake that he's going to row across with Catherine Barclay to get to Switzerland. So he's going to escape the war for good. She's pregnant, she's going to have a baby, and they're going to hole up in the mountains, a place, Montreux, not unlike Sun Valley, and they're going to have this baby. But before he goes, he meets Count Greffy, who he'd known before, and they play a game of pool. And so right prior to Frederick launching this escape across the lake into Switzerland, he has some questions for Count Greffy, and here's how it goes. Frederick says, "You're wise." And the Count says, "No, it's a great fallacy, the wisdom of old men. They do not grow wise, they grow careful." Well, perhaps that's wisdom. It's a very unattractive wisdom. "What do you value most?" "Someone I love," says Frederick. "With me, it is the same. That is not wisdom. Do you value life?" "Yes." "So do I," says the Count, "because it's all I have." So I go into much more detail in the book on why that's important, but there's a lot in here. This is the only life we get. There is no afterlife. And so he's getting an affirmation here that it's okay that you haven't found faith in your life. And the Count admits later on that he didn't find it either. But he also says to him, "What's the most important thing in your life?" And hoping that Frederick says, "Someone I love," and he does. And he says, "Well, with me, it is the same. Do not be careless about it. Don't take it for granted. Be careful about that love for Catherine Barclay." And so great, I would consider that wisdom. And it falls into the category of find faith in love. If you can't find faith in God, you can't find faith in divine providence, then find faith in love. And so he embarks on that journey with that mentor advice. I'm going to skip that, but basically there's a great mentor in For Whom the Bell Tolls, where Robert Jordan learns that they're going to have to seek penance for all the killing that they're doing because they're killing fellow Spaniards. Well, while I'm here, I might as well do it. So we don't have religion after the war, says Anselmo. There's got to be some civic penance organized that all may be cleansed from the killing, or else we will never have a true and human basis for living. And Robert Jordan later reflects, "You have no right to forget anything. You have no right to shut your eyes to any of it. No right to forget any of it, nor soften it or change it." And he later on said, "You never kill the people you want to kill at war." And so there it is. There's an older man in For Whom the Bell Tolls, like Count Greffy, giving a younger man advice about how they're going to cleanse themselves after the atrocities they've seen at war, but also that they have committed themselves. A lot of the innocents caught up, the collateral damage, they call it now, caught up in the crossfire of war. So last one, we're getting there. This is it. This is take responsibility for wrongs. Don't blame others for wrongs caused by yourself. Cleanse the self by avoiding repeating mistakes. And one of the most famous Hemingway lines, "Get strong in the broken places." In A Farewell to Arms, the longer passage is, if we live long enough in this world, we will all be broken. And the best get strong in the broken places. And what does he mean by that? That you don't suffer from arrested development. The setbacks in life, the psychological setbacks, the physical setbacks, the bad luck, the pandemic, you don't let those things define you, but you get strong in the places that were most hurt or destroyed by those setbacks. there he is with Bullet again. Really quick story about this. He's on a hunt on Silver Creek with John Betcher and his wife, Anna Roosevelt, the daughter of the president. And they're canoeing down Silver Creek, and they've got Bullet with them. There's the dog, the black lab, in the canoe, and they see some ducks, come near the water, and Ernest Hemingway quickly paddles into the reeds, and John Betcher goes to pick up his gun quickly. He didn't have his safety on the gun, and he picks up the gun by the trigger, and as he pulls back on the gun, he pulls the trigger, and he shoots the leg off of the black lab Bullet. Ernest Hemingway was furious. And he really felt that John Betcher wasn't apologetic, wasn't taking responsibilities for that careless action. So he gets out of the canoe, gets in the car, drives back to Sun Valley Resort himself, won't talk to anybody. He's up on the room 206 balcony. You can remember that image of Ernest Hemingway on the balcony with a typewriter. He's cleaning his shotguns. And Martha Gellhorn's come back from the hunt. She's having a cocktail on the terrace. And all of a sudden she hears 2 shots, bang, bang, from room 206, right? She's right above her, basically, on the terrace. And she's like, oh my goodness, Ernest Hemingway has shot John Betcher over the damn dog. But that wasn't the case. 2 geese had flown by, and 1 goose was trailing a leg. And so Hemingway, from his balcony with his gun, loads it and kills the 2 geese and finishes off what was a bad day by completing a task well. And then the last story connects to the Hemingway Trail Creek Memorial. There's Gooding and Hemingway and Gene Van Gilder and Taylor Williams on a pheasant hunt. And Gene Van Gilder with Steve Hannigan, as you recall, was integral in getting Hemingway to come to Idaho, free room and board, for publicity photos. He hunted a lot with Gene Van Gilder down in Silver Creek, and here they are in the fields, I imagine in Gooding, hunting on the Gooding farm. And but 3 months into his first day in 1939, Hemingway wasn't on this hunt, but Lloyd Arnold was, a dear friend of Ernest Hemingway and hunting companion and hunting guide at Sun Valley Resort. So Lloyd Arnold's in the stern of the canoe, and Dave Benner, who's a 17-year-old apprentice hunting guide, was in the middle of the canoe, and Gene Van Gilder is in the bow of the canoe, and they're on the Snake River, and these low-flying ducks go by, and they're still moving. Lloyd's paddling, and Gene stands up and takes a shot at the ducks and misses, and the gunwale rocks, just like the photo you see. And Dave Benner, the 17-year-old, stands up at the same time and takes a shot at the ducks as well, but he doesn't recognize that the rocking of the canoe would cause his shotgun to swing, and it swings tragically right into the back of Gene Van Gilder, and he blows a hole in the back of Gene Van Gilder, and 34-year-old Gene Van Gilder dies on the banks of the Snake River in 30 minutes. And there's a photo, one of my favorite photos, of Hemingway out of the canoe. And so there's an unspoken rule about hunting from watercraft. You never hunt from a moving craft. You always wait for it to be anchored. And if you hunt even from an anchored boat, typically it's a one-man show. And if you're traveling a canoe, traveling in a boat, you unload your gun. You've at the very least put the safety on. And so Hemingway knew what had gone down on the Snake River, and he knew that they were responsible. So I just like that photo. So there he is out of the canoe hunting. And so Lloyd Arnold comes to Hemingway seeking solace, wondering what to do and how they're going to handle it. And Ernest Hemingway turns to him and says, how can we call it anything but impulsive action? No, you and Gene Van Gilder were a fine team and didn't go about telling each other what to do. And I admire your stand, but I won't buy it. I'm involved too. And I think it's the I'm involved too that's really important with respect to this code principle. Clearly, Hemingway is admitting that they've gone on hunts and they have not followed the code principle of unloading their guns. They've shot from a moving canoe. And so here's the result. We're all a part of Jean's death. And so Hemingway handled a lot of the press. He went over and spent time, obviously, with Jean's wife and family. And his wife asked Ernest Hemingway if he would write the eulogy for Jean Van Gilder. And I got to remember, he had only known Jean for 3 months. And he said, oh, no, there are many people who could say, much more about Jean than I could. And then she said, no, I insist that he really admired you. And it would mean a lot to me if you wrote the eulogy. And it's a beautiful eulogy if you read the whole thing. But at the bottom of Trail Creek Memorial, it says this about Jean Van Gilder. Best of all, he loved the fall, the leaves yellow on the cottonwoods, leaves floating on the trout streams, and above the hills, the high blue windless skies. Now he will be part of them forever. That's about as mystical and transcendental as Ernest Hemingway has ever gotten about the soul, joining the soul in nature. But I like to think about this. So I encourage you to go out and visit some of these sites. Please go to the cemetery, look at the house from afar, go to the Hemingway Monument down in Silver Creek, go look at room 206 and think about the geese he shot from the balcony. But go to Trail Creek Memorial and know that that eulogy is about Jean, and it's about taking responsibilities for wrongs. He wrote the eulogy, he leaned into that responsibility, and he also maintained a lifelong friendship with Lloyd Arnold. And so I just want to end with this, for those of the locals, that I hope that you recognize that, Ernest Hemingway will be part of our streams and hills and blue windless skies forever. And I hope he'll be part of you. And as we seek our better selves in following these code principles. That's all I have. Thanks. If there's still people out there.
Yes, there are 22 people still there. Why don't you stop your screen share?
Okay.
And I will cancel the spotlight. So we're all kind of in this together. If you folks are interested, you can go up to the upper right-hand corner and you'll see a little grid of 9 dots. You can click on that and you'll see all the tiles at once. So we kind of come together as a community at the end. So while you're working your way through that, I just want to thank you so much, Phil. That was incredible. Just your expertise and your passion for it and your articulateness and it really was, I'm glad we recorded it.
Thank you, Kristen. That's very kind.
Yeah.
I told you I could fill up the space. I like to talk.
Yes. We've got some big thank yous with lots of exclamation points and someone saying, yo, Phil. But we have a few minutes for questions. If you would like, you can unmute yourself and we'll just see if there's a herd of horses that want to ask questions. Maybe there'll need to be some moderating, but maybe not. So if you have questions for Phil, unmute yourself and we'll see where we go with this.
That's okay. My feelings aren't hurt. I covered it all.
Well, I'm gonna break the ice here.
John, nice.
How are you?
Good, man.
So,
Good to see you.
Ernest Hemingway was a man's man, but he was also an anti-fascist. Now, on tonight, the night that Donald Trump is getting renominated as a Hemingway scholar, where would he fall in this kind of political kind of milieu that we're in?
Well, I'm going to go with your lead. He would be anti-Trump in a big way. No, I mean, I think it's important to recognize from the Bartels that, he is probably the book that he cared about the most and the war that he cared about the most. These people that he spent time with as a journalist over in Spain, You got to remember, they're fighting for freedom from oppression. They're fighting for civil liberties. They're fighting for separation of church and state. They're fighting for, the ability to own their land. I mean, it was that basic. And so, yeah, I mean, he had a deep-seated hatred for dictators and fascism, or any abuse of power at the expense of civil liberties. So he would not be a Trump supporter. I'm sorry if that isolates some of my audience, but I'm going to go out and say it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Phil.
Nice. So I'll just say, and please, more questions. I love if you do have questions, but the real takeaway is that if you read the book, just solely the book, it doesn't really work. Like, you got to go read at least a short story. Or Farewell to Arms, and be disciplined enough to say, like, okay, I'm just going to get through it. And then you can just look at the index and look at all the moments in which Farewell to Arms and read that. But the book makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more interesting when you have a character on board to think about as you're reading.
So there's a comment in the chat that takes a little bit different angle, Phil. It says, thank you so much. I've been reading your book, and this talk has helped me to understand it with more depth.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Good. That's the idea.
Any other questions?
Well, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to mention, Phil, that this presentation, those photographs were just so amazing. And, I'm a visual person, so I need to get caught up with the reading, but that really just brought so much to life for me to see those great photographs. So that was really enjoyable.
Well, thank you, Patty. Yeah, we were lucky because wherever he went, he was photographed. I mean, he was probably the most photographed writer of all time. He didn't do anything locally here without someone taking a picture of him. So those are iconic photos, yeah, especially the Robert Capa one on the cover. I love that one. Other thoughts, other questions? You don't necessarily have a question, but you can just comment.
Well, I guess I have a little comment. My father loved to fish, especially fly fish, and he was handy. So he ordered a print from Sunset Magazine of all the native species of trout in Idaho and framed it. And at the bottom, there was on a little piece of paper that somehow had been typed or gotten from someplace, was a little quote tucked, between the frame and the glass. And I always loved it. We hung it in our family room, and I just always loved the image and loved the quote. And it was years before I realized that it was the quote, "Most of all, he loved the fall."
Huh.
And I included that quote when my dad died, actually. That was part of the celebration of life. But I don't think at that point I knew that it was Hemingway. But so it was particularly interesting and moving to me to know that story. I knew before your talk that it was a eulogy, but how that kind of wove into everything else about his life and his writings and his time here and his friendships and that sort of sense of sort of personal obligation and of when somebody asks you to write a eulogy for somebody that you've only known for 3 months,
Yeah,
you do it because
right.
that's what you've been asked to do. That's the challenge. And
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much for sharing that.
No, you're welcome. My pleasure. It's a beautiful eulogy. I wish you could read. I didn't quote the whole thing in the book, but if you did a Google search, you'd find it. It's really interesting. Other thoughts?
Go ahead.
Just a quick question, Phil. Hi, this is Lou.
Oh, hi, Lou.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Yes, thank you. And living on Silver Creek now, those stories bring a lot of meaning. Living on Silver Creek again, I should say.
Right.
Have a favorite story from Silver Creek, just to help me sort of fill out the stories I can share?
Yeah, I kind of shared them already tonight, Lou. You know, I just love telling that story of you know, John Betcher, you know, tragically shooting the leg off of a bullet, but just, you know, Hemingway going back and shooting the geese to clean up a bad day. It's just classic Ernest Hemingway. Other Silver Creek stories. I mean, one of the chapters I'm most proud of in my writing is the value nature chapter, and I think I would encourage you, Lou, to check that out. It's got a lot about Nature Conservancy in there. It's got a lot about you know, his relationship to wilderness, to nature, was formed at a very specific period in environmental history, but also it was formed by his as a hunter, as a fisherman, as someone who didn't just observe nature, who didn't just, you know, passively, oh, isn't that so beautiful, but he saw himself as a participant in the ecosystem. And he came to, as I mentioned earlier, you know, he came to see the outsized impact that man can have upon the places he loved the most. The African safaris at the very end of his life, he refused to hunt. And he's dramatically reduced, if he did go hunting, the amount of animals that he killed. And that was not the case early on, because he saw the impacts that the safaris were having. You know, the Gulf Stream, he saw the impacts they're having on the marlin fishing. And so I just think it's a great, I know you're deeply interested in wilderness preservation. I think it's a great sort of end to the Hemingway, or important piece of the Hemingway legacy, that Jack spent so much time working with the Nature Conservancy to preserve Silver Creek, that ultimately, you know, the mountains that he loves so much to look at from his Warm Springs home are now called the Hemingway Boulder White Cloud Wilderness. I just love being able to share that it lives on. And, you know, the house itself, 14.5 acres of pristine riverfront on the Bigwood, will never be developed. And so, you know, he might not have gotten to, in his lifetime, to the level of considering himself an environmentalist, or, you know, actively working upon preservation of land, but his son did. And it lives on in the preservation of Silver Creek in the wilderness just above Ketchum.
Yeah, and some of the stories you shared about really his, you know, deep-rooted, he was a conservationist, and just how he grew in his understanding of the relationship with nature.
Right.
I don't think that comes through very often. It's more about, you know, the big hunter. But he really had a deeper appreciation and understanding of those ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I appreciate that you tied in Jack's work to the Hemingway legacy. You know, that's very insightful for me, because I personally get turned off by all the killing. It's very difficult for me. But to gain this insight that that he saw the harm that it was doing to the places that he loved the most, and changed his actions, and that legacy was passed on to his son, who did tremendous work here, is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and to your point, Kristen, I mean, the whole kill mentality, I mean, I just want to be, it's the best example of a principle that he developed in his fictional characters that he often failed to like achieve in his own life. And so he hunted coyote from plains here in Idaho. He loved to go on magpie shoot. That's another Silver Creek story at Bud Purdy's ranch. They would collect the magpies because the magpies will eat at the cattle sores, and they eat songbirds' eggs or whatever. They're just considered nuisance birds. And so they would collect all these magpies, and then Hemingway was like, well, what are you going to do with them? We're just going to poison them. Like, well, why don't we just like release the net, and like, why don't we just shoot as many as we possibly can, and like and they did. They had this festival every year, and Hemingway created a little trophy for the one who could like shoot the most magpies. And again, it's a different era, but he also, in my research, I discovered that there was a rabbit infestation in the 1940s in these farms, and so he would go down and knock on their doors of these farmers and say, "Hey, can we go out and hunt these rabbits?" And they would kill hundreds of rabbits. The farmers wanted it because they were devastating their crops. But I forget the name of the individual who said that, but he said, one of the hunting guides, there's one thing about Hemingway's time here that I didn't like, was his kill mentality. That he just loved to be on the winning end of that experience between predator and prey. And the best example, and I won't go on, and I know you guys have gone on with your labs, but the best example of a character who lives up to the code And Hemingway not living up the code is Santiago in Old Man in the Sea, where he brings in the marlin, attaches it to the skiff, and he knows he shouldn't have gone out alone. He needed help, but the sharks come and start eating the marlin, and it creates this feeding frenzy. But instead of letting the sharks just have at this 9-foot marlin, he decides he's going to hit each shark that comes by with a piece of wood to keep the sharks at bay, knowing the whole time this is futile, this is not going to work. Eventually these sharks are going to get this marlin, but I'm not going to just let them have at it. And the contrary experience for Ernest Hemingway is, this is a story written by John Dos Passos, where he says, I was out hunting on Hemingway's boat Pilar in the Gulf Stream, and we were hunting for, I think it was tuna, these giant fish. And he was, the sharks would see that something's wrong with the tuna, and so the sharks would target the fish that was being reeled in. And so Hemingway would grab a machine gun and machine gun the sharks. And I mean, you talk about like the opposite of the character Santiago doing what he needs to do, it's just, but yeah, he definitely, and then, all the big game hunting that he did in the safaris. I think the negative reputation of kill, kill, kill mentality is appropriate. But I do think, he grew out of that later on in his life.
So just a couple more things as we wrap up. Somebody left a lovely thing in the chat that I just wanted to share. Great job. You've inspired me to revisit the Hemingway classics.
Nice.
Love your depth of knowledge and passion. And I just wanted to chime in with this too. Your students are lucky.
My sister loves me.
And just a reminder to everybody, we'll be getting Phil's book at the library to check out real soon. You can purchase his books in Haley at Iconoclast and catch him at Chapter 1, Lost River Outfitter, Silver Creek. You listed a whole bunch of places. So they're widely available. So please take advantage of that. I'm sure it's a great read, especially coming kind of from Phil's mouth tonight and then diving a bit more deeply into it yourselves. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. And Phil, thanks again for a really exceptional presentation.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everybody.